Hello, everyone. I'm very glad that you came to this webinar devoted to the practical tips while developing a new products. My name is Sergey Voronkevich, and I'll share the screen with information about the webinar and myself. And I would kindly ask you to write a couple words about yourself in the chat box. While I'll be telling a couple words about myself, try to write about your job role and function in the company and experience in data protection. Maybe you could write down how deeply you are involved in data privacy and what is your motivation and the motivation of your company. There are some template answers over here, and let's move to my self-presentation. So my name is Sergey Voronkevich. I'm a head of Data Privacy School and chief consultant of Data Privacy Office. Those companies specialize in data protection training and data protection consultancy. I'm certified information privacy professional Europe, which is certification provided by IAPP, and manager technologist in the information privacy. And I also hold FIP, which is Fellow of Information Privacy designation. I'm the author of specialized training courses, DPP, which is Data Privacy Professional, and DPM, Data Privacy Manager. Those trainings are delivered by the company that I founded, which is called Data Privacy School and Data Privacy Office. My background is in law. I used to work in a number of companies, but started with the GDPR in 2015 when I started to work with Allianz SE, and my work was related to the data protection. And besides, I wrote a master thesis devoted to the GDPR back then. It was the time when GDPR was not yet signed into the law, and I was very lucky to join the team that was preparing for the GDPR many years in advance. Let's move to today's topic. Today, we're gonna see the most useful 5 hints that might be useful while developing your software product. But first, we'll speak about the motivation for the business to comply with the GDPR. GDPR is notorious with the huge fines your company could face for violating principles relating data processing and data subject rights, or using the wrong legal basis, or breaking cross-border transfer rules, or serious infringements. Those fines can be up to 4% of the annual turnover of your company or the group of companies, or up to 20 million euros. There are minor violations, second tier of fines, represented by the violations of information security rules and lack of risk assessment and lack of data breach notification. This is quite good motivator for the businesses to think about data privacy. You can see that the fines huge, but please keep in mind that this is the upper level. This is the amount the fines should not go above. And you can see real fines and real cases of the data protection violations at 2 resources. One is official by European Data Protection Board, which is European Supervisory Authority, and the second one is Enforcement Tracker. You can see that fines could be around 4,000 euro or 24,000 euro, etc. But I want to say that the violations and the sanctions for breaching the GDPR are not the only reason why software companies and IT product companies should comply with the regulation. Another reason for that is the data protection by design and by default rules, which requires the data controller, which is company, deciding on the purposes and means of the data processing, to use the software and use the means which appropriate could meet the level of risk, could allow the company to carry out the data minimization and retention periods and allow fulfillment data subject rights. This requirement effectively forbids company in European Union and companies that are outside that have to follow GDPR rules from using the software or cloud solutions that does not allow them to fulfill all the requirements of the GDPR. You cannot transfer these violations and risk to the provider of this software service because both data processor and data controller are responsible for GDPR compliance. So in that case, it's even stricter motivation and bigger motivation for the companies to comply with the GDPR, because in that case, it's actually your corporate clients who will be asking for the GDPR compliance, who will be sending you the checklist about your software, about your servers, about your procedures, about your data deletion procedures also. And actually, it's a kind of a precondition for doing business in Europe. In that case, while developing these software solutions, you need to design your software with privacy in mind. The best time for doing so, it's when actually starting the product, because otherwise you introduce a lot of changes to comply with the regulation. And as many of you probably know, those changes take a lot of time and effort, and sometimes can be tricky, cannot be implemented. In some cases, they would probably require the complete overhaul of the architecture of your software. Let's start with the first point regarding the identification of the data subjects and internal identifiers that you use in your software, in your systems for singling out your users. According to the GDPR, personal data is any data relating to identified or identifiable individual. It means that personal data includes not just identifier itself, but any data connected with the identifier. In case of personal data, when we deal with the identifier, we should keep in mind that identifier is any bit of information that is used to single out or recognize data subject. If you use some number or email to recognize the data subject, the user in your system, this is the identifier, and all information connected with this identifier, for instance, the history of interactions and payment history, is also a personal data because it's related to this identifier. The question arises whether we could use some personal information, some contact information as identifier in the system. And it's a quite crucial question because sometimes the whole architecture of the software is built up identifiers. I was delivering presentation to the audience of IT startups, and one member of the audience came to me and said, okay, we use the email numbers as identifiers in our system. Email number is kind of identification number strictly very closely embedded in the phone to the device, and it could not be changed. What should we do about the right to be forgotten? What should we do about data minimization requirement? And in that case, I had to answer that, okay, you have no other solution other than stopping and changing your architecture. You cannot use email number or phone number or email address as an internal identifier of the user. The reason why is that it will be hard for you to fulfill the right of the users for the right to be forgotten or the right to object against the processing. It would be hard for you to minimize the risk for data subject because in every bit of your system, this identifier internal ID, user ID is used. So it would be hard to minimize the data, and it would be almost impossible to fulfill your obligations under the GDPR. Please avoid using such data as the phone number, as personal ID, as full name or email address, as internal identifier in the system. It's all right when you use phone number or email as a login information, but this login information should be then connected to the internal identifier, which would be generated by your system uniquely for this user. And then data subject comes to you and asks to be forgotten. You could delete this identifying information like phone number and email address and keep your internal user ID, because you might still need this information for some obvious purposes, for instance, for statistical purposes or for bookkeeping. The first and most important advice for you to avoid using the real personal data, real contact details as internal identifiers in the system. If you want to get down to the definition of personal information and try to find out what else is personal data, please come to the course of devoted to the GDPR. It's the definition itself, it's quite complex, but I even had to develop some kind of formula of personal data to describe this definition of personal data. But since we have a time limit, we are focusing entirely on this part of the personal data, which is ID, identification, user ID in your system, or other ID that you use to identify the payer or client. There is another requirement in the GDPR that puzzles a lot of businesses, which is requirement to have privacy by default. I have to show you this infographic, this chart, to describe the certain types and categories of predetermined configurations, to give you advice on how to keep conversion rates high while still configuring your system in a privacy-friendly way. All configurations in your system could be described by answering two questions: whether this configuration could be changed by a user, whether it's configured by a user, and whether this, if it could be configured, whether you select a default set. Let's see this chart, see all the categories of the configurations. So there are two types of configurations. First of all, those that could be configured actually by user, hard-coded into the software. If you hard code some decisions, some option into the software, it's very crucial that this configuration is privacy friendly. Otherwise, you risk to be responsible for the violation of Article 25 of the GDPR. For instance, privacy friendly configuration, which is strictly embedded into the product, is HTTPS, which is secure protocol used in mail service like Gmail. It's a privacy-friendly configuration and it's hard-coded. Users, they cannot choose which protocol is used to send the messages. Only secure protocol could be used with Gmail, and this decision is taken by the company. While 10 or 15 years ago, it used to be other way around when they used HTTP for downloading and the content of the page. But then they firstly introduced the choice. They allowed the choice by the users whether to use HTTP or HTTPS, and then they switched to HTTPS as a default setting, and then they get rid of the HTTP option at all. There is a huge risk while hard coding privacy hostile settings in your software. For instance, this is the case of Uber. By the way, the Uber got the fine and sanctions from American regulator, FTC, Federal Trade Commission, precisely for this violation. The first versions of the app were using geolocation data about users, not only when user was launching the app, but also when the app was off, and it was sending the location to the Uber services 24/7. In that case, they hard-coded this choice, they hard-coded this setting in the application, though they disclosed this in the privacy notice. They said, okay, if you don't want to send your location 24/7, then you please don't install our app. But in that case, it was unnecessary and was not proportionate, and FTC sanctioned Uber for this kind of violation. If you repeat this violation in your case, for instance, if the choice is possible, for instance, if the telemetric data could be sent to your service for bug fixing and you don't allow the users to configure this, and you just embed and hard code this choice, this option into your software, you might be going the same way as Uber, and you might face quite severe punishment for that. The first thing here is please do not hard code privacy hostile settings in your software. Don't expect supervisory authorities or privacy activists not recognizing this threat. For instance, there's been a case when journalists, I think it was Washington Post, but one of the American newspapers, they analyzed top 10 applications in market of Google or Apple, and they analyzed the traffic that was sent by those apps. And they saw that a lot of apps were sending a lot of information by default. After the article was published, a lot of apps faced real consequences for these hard-coded settings. And when you allow those pre-configured or not pre-configured settings, could be either be changed by the user when the change is possible, but it has a default setting, and no default setting is set, but the choice by user is possible or necessary. I'll give you a couple of examples of the privacy-friendly, privacy-hostile settings here. So in case the default settings present might well be privacy friendly. For instance, when you use a Brave browser, it has the mechanism for automatic deletion of the cookies of all websites visited after the session is over. So this is privacy friendly setting, and it is pre-configured in the browser, but you may change it, and you may allow the browser to record and keep those cookies to allow you quick login in the web services that you constantly use. And a privacy hostile setting is pre-ticked box at your website with a newsletter subscription. As you probably know, those pre-ticked boxes, pre-ticked consents are forbidden under the GDPR. It's happening quite often when the company decides, okay, if we don't pre-tick those boxes, people won't subscribe to our newsletter, and conversion rates will be so low that we wouldn't be able to remarket new services. And that's actually wrong. And it's not true. There is privacy-friendly option for this case. The second option, when there is no pre-configuration at all, you may force users to make a choice about the privacy. For instance, instead of using this type of dialog when you have a box and consent, agree, blah, 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 you may switch to another variant of yes, no questions. And as a matter of fact, the conversion rate with this kind of architecture, with tick box architecture, especially if you follow the GDPR and don't use the pre-ticked boxes, keep it empty, it's very low. It might reach like 0.5% of the users who will agree to the data processing. But in case of yes and no question, in case when you ask and require user to make this decision, you might well be getting around 60 or 70% of the conversion. It's not 95% like you would have if you pre-ticked this box, but it's way more better than 0.5% of the users who chose to subscribe to your newsletter. So this is my second tip. You have some space in the user experience area to follow the GDPR rules and still comply with the Article 25 requiring the software to be having privacy-friendly settings by default, selected by default. We announced the second tip about using the phone book of your users. Many mobile apps developers would like to get an access to the contact list of the person, to use this as a way to allow the users networking inside the application. For instance, when the app notifies other users that someone joined the network, uses this app, and could be reached directly through the app, or as a way to use this contact book as a way for marketing and spreading the word about your wonderful service. The second case, the second application is quite risky and quite problematic, because in that case, it's not only data subject, not only your user's data, which is uploaded to the service, but also a data of the contacts of the user. And those contacts, those people in the phone book might not have a clue about the service, your service, about this data processing. Let me draw this situation. For instance, you have Alex, whose phone book is uploaded to your server through the app you developed. And for instance, these phone numbers belong to his contacts. And let's call one of them Mary. In the case of this upload, you're trying to process the data of data subject 1, which is Alex, and a lot of other data subjects. As I said earlier, you need to notify those data subjects about the processing of their information, and probably use one of the legal bases to getting this information. In that case, you would probably need their consent for this upload. And technically and organizationally, it would be almost impossible for you to get these phone numbers with the consent attached from those people. I don't imagine any way how you would get the consent before the processing happens. And according to the GDPR rules, the same time the phone number is uploaded, the processing started, and this notification and consent getting should happen right before this moment, should happen in advance. So this gap in time is required, and in that case, there is no way for Alex to get consent from the all hundreds of contacts that he has in his phone book. I think this kind of processing is very problematic for a lot of apps. So what could be done in that situation? And many of the mobile phone applications are using this way. Instead of uploading the phone number itself, like they use a hash function on the device itself, which transforms this phone number into hash. And they transfer not the phone number, but rather they transfer the hash of this phone number. What allows this hash list? How could you use those hashes in what way you might need them? So when you collected those hash numbers of the data subjects, hash 1, hash 2, hash 3, there is a way for you to allow this networking opportunity within your app. For instance, if you collected the hash numbers from Alex, hashes of the phone numbers from Alex, and you, for instance, have another user, Mary, in your database, and you probably know the phone number of Mary. So you get the same hash of the same phone number in two places. One place one is those uploaded hash numbers from the Alex phone book, and another place is the user directory or user catalog. So all the users, their phone numbers are transformed into hash and into hashes themselves. And then only thing that you need to allow Alex to recognize that Mary is present in this network is to compare those hashes between themselves. And when you compare them and you see, okay, this hash of phone plus 49 of German phone is the same as the hash of this user, you can allow Alex to know, okay, Mary is in a network. You may connect to her directly. You may send her a direct message, you can transfer money to her, etc., 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 depending on what your app is doing. Hashing is a way better mechanism for collecting this information from the phone books. And as I said earlier, what happens with these requirements about the transparency, about getting consent? There is an exception in the GDPR rules. You need to notify about the data processing, but in case this requires disproportionate efforts and technically impossible, you might keep this obligation. You might keep this processing without providing the full information to the data subjects. In that case, you get rid of this requirement of the informing data subjects because you probably have no way to get the phone numbers from the hashes because it's a one-way process and you cannot deduct real phone numbers from the hash. And you cannot use hash for sending messages. You may only find out the phone number when this user is in your system. For instance, if you has the phone number of all your present users, hash plus phone numbers, then you can recognize, okay, this hash belongs to Mary and Mary's phone number is this one. The same situation happens with a legal basis. You cannot get the consent from another two data subjects, but you might not need to get this consent from them because there is quite a useful legal basis for the processing, which is called legitimate interest, LI. So legitimate interest, I would call it silent consent, is the basis that you rely on when the processing is low risk, of low risk, when it's proportionate and necessary for the purposes. So after doing procedure called LIA, legitimate interest assessment, you may proceed and keep the hashes of those third and fourth data subject in your database without getting their consent. The hashing itself allows you to find a piece with the requirement of transparency and the requirement of getting the proper legal basis. As I said before, using these contact books of your users for marketing purposes or for other operations that would need a full number, raw number, they are highly risky and problematic from the GDPR standpoint. I strongly advise you to avoid such kind of business models and architectures when you use the raw phone numbers of the contact book. There is a case of the app called Get Contact that actually collects the raw phone numbers from the user's devices. And this app and this processing is very risky. And I don't see any way how this processing would be compatible and compliant to the GDPR. This app is still present in the markets. It's still installed on the millions of the devices, but I think it's a matter of time when provider authorities of data subjects start to investigate this topic and ask the questions on what basis my personal data, my phone number, was uploaded to these app servers by some of my contacts, some of my friends or some acquaintances. And it's also equally risky both for the app itself and those people who are using this app. According to the GDPR, Article 12 of the GDPR, your privacy notice should be intelligible, well-structured to be readable and comprehensible and concise. And those requirements, not only from Article 12 of the GDPR, but also they are in the guidance on transparency, which is guidance issued by European Data Protection Board. As you can see from the checklist, by the way, this checklist will be available for those visiting this webinar, or it is available for those watching this webinar in the recording at GDPR text.com website. You may go to the Article 13 of the GDPR to download this checklist, and you'll get this checklist with the materials of the webinar. We'll share this mirror link to all the slides. As you can see, in spite of this requirement for your privacy notice to be clear, to be comprehensible, there is a lot of data, a lot of information you should add into your privacy notice, into your privacy policy. You shall introduce yourself, disclose the identity of your company. You should give the contact details of your company. You should disclose the purposes, all the purposes of all processing operations, and show the legal basis like consent, legitimate interest, requirement by law. You need to show the list of the categories of data that you collected about the data subjects from somebody else, recipients of personal data, etc. And if you ask me whether it's possible to fit all this information into short and concise text, I would probably tell you no. It's not possible to have a descriptive text explaining all those things about your application, about your software, about your company in the form of just a text, like a novel, like a description. It will be long. It will be hard to read. It will be the course of GDPR violation. How to comply with both of those requirements? First, the requirement to mention all this information, and the second is to provide clear and comprehensive information. I would say that the best form for this, for showing and explaining the link between the purpose, legal ground, legal basis, and categories of data used, and allowing your users to know about the storage period, is using the tables. It's very simple. It does not require extra knowledge or something. Just try to deliver this information in the table. It saves you one page of table, replaces 3 texts of the text. You are able to make your privacy quite short and quite easy to understand. It's well-structured form. It allows users to find the information which is relevant to their situation. It's not overloading people with some unnecessary information. First of all, this core information of the privacy notice, I think the best way to put it is in the table form. What about other information? Because along with the legal grounds and purposes, you need to deliver a lot of other additional information. For instance, the consequences of automatic decision making, the consequences of not providing you the data when it's necessary under the contract. Here is a good example of the quite appropriate privacy notice. Full disclosure, this website, VPCheck.com, and this privacy notice is generated by our team. I'm personally and my team are responsible for this document. So the best way for me to explain is to use the examples from my practice. In case here, you can see the easy navigation that allows users to navigate between the chapters of your privacy notice. That saves a lot of time for users to read this. Besides that, we have hidden the information into expand beside those buttons that allow users to expand the additional information. And as you can see from here, when you, for instance, when you want to describe that you use Stripe, SmartLook, and Google Analytics and Facebook Pixel, it fits into just 4 lines. It's 3 lines in this privacy notice. And this approach is called multi-layered approach. The first layer is obviously, this is the layer when all additional information is condensed. Second layer is when people expand the information by clicking here. So this is a good approach. It requires certain web designer involvement into the creation of this document, but it's really important to use this method to keep your privacy notice short. One more thing is very important, is to allowing people navigate through looking at the pictograms. So those pictograms are not official yet. They are developed by a special project by University of Bologna, and it might be one of the options that the European Data Protection Board will be considering while adopting the universal European set of the icons. In case of this privacy notice, we included those icons into the document to allow users easy navigation and understanding of the chapters and certain types of information. And you can see that we used emojis to actually show categories of data and legal basis. It's quite easy to understand. It's easy to search for information. It fits especially younger generation. So when they communicate through exchanging the emojis, they expect you to speak their language and use emojis too. This is a good example of keeping your privacy notice short. If you don't have a web designer or you don't have a privacy professional that could develop this privacy notice, people usually ask whether they allowed to use privacy notice generators. There are a lot of websites, quite nice products and websites allowing you to generate privacy notice, but I have to give you a heads up. First of all the privacy notices that you have in your company should cover all the processing operations inside the company. For instance, many of these websites, those generators are making and creating the privacy notices only for the website user. They don't, for instance, if you have a restaurant and you use some privacy notice generator, you might well be developing the privacy notice for the websites alone, but it does not explain users on how you process their booking, table bookings, and other information that you collect through the phone, or the information that you might be collecting through for the paper forms, for instance, while creating your loyalty program. This is the great minus for the privacy notice generators. They usually don't cover all the processing operation. There is one exception that I know, and I'll tell you later about this exceptional privacy notice generator. But let's go further. The second requirement is the requirement that text should be concise, readable, and easy to understand for anyone, including people without the legal education, without technical skills. One more requirement is to have your privacy notices in the languages of your data subjects. For instance, if you are a university and you have, for instance, university in Switzerland, and you have French-speaking people, English-speaking people, and international students coming who speak only English, and you have German speakers, then your web interface, the website interface probably is translated into 3 or 4 languages. For instance, you have Italian, German, English, French versions of your website. And that means that you should communicate to data subjects in all those 4 languages when delivering the information about their privacy. So privacy notice should be translated in the languages of your interface. If you have 5 interfaces, 5 language versions of your website, then it means that you have to translate your privacy notice into those 5 languages. And one more thing that is hard to meet when using these privacy notice generators is that privacy notice should be constantly updated. If you have new processing operation, if, for instance, you never used, for instance, Facebook Pixel or never used a CRM, and you introduced those systems into your company, then you should add those CRMs and analytics systems into your privacy notice. One exception is VPCheck, which is privacy notice generator that is developed with the participation of the Data Privacy Office, the company that I belong to. We developed this privacy notice generator, keeping in mind all those requirements. First of all, it's industry specific. It does not cover all the businesses. It covers mostly small and medium-sized businesses, quite typical standard businesses like restaurants, hotels, events and conferences, gyms, stores. There is industry of mobile apps, but we don't focus on IT. In this way, we managed to collect the information about internal processes happening in those kind of companies and include them into the privacy notice. So you pick up the industry that relates to your business. For instance, you pick up a hospital and you get privacy notice with the processing operations that are typical for the hospitals. And this privacy notice will include not just hospitals, not just the Google Analytics and some other processings, some other tools that you use to process the data of your website visitors, but also the data of your patients. Another thing is multi-language. We have so far, we added 5 languages to this tool, and we are working on adding more languages to this privacy notice generator, which allows you to skip hiring a lot of translators from 2 different languages. Try this app, try this generator, and let me know whether you liked it. There is a free tariff for typical businesses, so you could use this demo or trial mode and get the full functional privacy notice for your website. And the last 5th tips that I want to give you is about there is a requirement to have an adequate measures taken in your company. And of course, when you ask a lawyer, what does adequate mean? He'll tell you everything. That he'll tell you that, oh, you have to keep information security up to date, you have to fulfill the rights, etc., etc. And one of the things that is required by this vague word adequate is training. According to the official Norwegian supervisory authority, they have a guidance, the guidance about the software development with data protection by default and by design. They think that this training, this total complete training of your staff is required, and they provide you with the, I would say, program for this training. It's not just a requirement for the business. It's not just a tick box exercise. Okay, we need to train our staff. It's also very useful for you to save money, to be independent. What I mean by being independent is the situation when you, without internal center of competence inside the company, without internal specialists in the company, it's quite hard to implement all the measures necessary, because those measures are required and should be conducted not only by lawyers, but also by software developers, by architects, by testers, by your HR department, by your marketing department. And every time those people have questions, they need some external consultant to go. And this is unsustainable, because external consultants, good external consultants, may cost you a fortune. The average price rate for GDPR consultant, for a good GDPR consultant, it's around 250, 300 euros per hour. I don't know any small and medium-sized business that could afford 60 hours of the consultant's involvement during the month. So in that case, I would strongly advise you to train your staff either through general program like GDPR Aware program, or use one of the courses available on the market. And of course, I shall also let you know that our company has such course itself. We deliver GDPR Data Privacy Professional course in English, and the next course starts on August 30, and it will end on September 15. It will be 3 times a week course held online in English, with the cost of 600 euro. But you may well use some other courses that allow people to get this fundamental knowledge of data protection and allow you to prepare your own specialists inside the company. When picking up those courses, try to check their program and compare it with the program developed by Norwegian Supervisory Authority. It's quite crucial for the team to have the knowledge about those chapters, those topics, and for technical team to have the knowledge on this technical side. Yeah, by the way, these technical points usually are not included into any data protection courses. You need to search for those topics like OWASP 100, etc. in the courses devoted to information security. Let's have an overlook of all information that I told you. The first point I want to say that be careful with picking up internal identifiers in your system and don't use the real identifiers or real contact information of the users. Secondly, if you need high conversion rates, use the option when no default setting is present that requires user to agree or disagree or with the processing. It's legal. When using and uploading the phone books of your mobile app users, please use the hashing to avoid needless privacy notices to hundreds or millions of users and to have a legitimate interest for this processing. Then I advise you to check your privacy notice if you have one against this checklist that you could find at GDPR.com website. I'll send you the link to the website. You can find it under the article 13 on the website and try out the VPCheck privacy notice generator if you want to have your privacy notice easy to understand. And final and the most useful action in the beginning and at the start is train your staff. Train your staff with either GDPR aware type of course for all your staff, or pick a couple of people in your company that you want to make privacy specialists, the reference people in the company that could be asked the routine questions about whether this kind of information is personal or not, and put them through the training. I would highly recommend the certification if you want to show the compliance to your clients. And this certification could be attained after 3, 4, or 5-day course. And one of the courses that might help you with this is GDPR Data Privacy Professional, which starts on August 30. Thank you for your attention.